مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أتى ورأى وانتصر. تلك المقولة اللاتينية القديمة المنسوبة إلى يوليوس كايزر هي الطريقة التي يود البيت الأبيض أن يتذكر العالم بها أولى رحلات الرئيس ترامب الدولية. إنها تعكس الترحيب الملكي الذي حظى به من ملك السعودية والأكثر من 50 زعيما من زعماء وقادة الدول العربية والمسلمة الذين جاءوا إلى الرياض للمشاركة في هذا الاجتماع غير المسبوق. إنها تعكس ثقة الرئيس خلال لقاءاته بكل من القادة الإسرائيليين والفلسطينيين، وتعكس الموقف القوي الذي اتخذه الرئيس حيال التجارة والأمن حين التقى بشركاء عسكريين واقتصاديين في أوروبا. ولكن منتقدي الرئيس ترامب لهم وجهة نظر مختلفة. رأوا زعيم العالم الحر أسعد بصحبة الملوك والدكاترة منه بصحبة زعماء الديمقراطيات الصديقة. رأوا زعيم العالم الحر لا ينبس ببنت شفر عن انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في السعودية ومصر وغيرها من الدول الصديقة في الشرق الأوسط، ولكنه انتقد بملء في حلفائنا القدامى في أوروبا. رأوا زعيم العالم الحر أكثر اهتماما ببيع الأسلحة منه ببناء الصداقات والتحالفات الحقيقية. أي قصة هي الأداك؟ ماذا حقق الرئيس من إنجازات خلال رحلته الدولية؟ وأي أثر سيكون للأزمة السياسية والقانونية المتفاقمة في الداخل على سياسة الإدارة الخارجية؟ لمناقشة هذه الأسئلة المهمة يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة التي تضم خبيرينا دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We're sitting with our panel of foreign policy experts to discuss President Trump's first overseas trip and its impact on American foreign policy. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us this morning. So the president left the tumult of Washington to go to the part of the world that was happiest about his election, the Middle East. Generally, a successful trip, Dennis?
Well, I certainly think the Middle East part of it was successful. I think the European part was much less so, but I think the Middle East part was successful, and in many ways it was almost doomed to succeed.
Doomed to succeed.
Doomed to succeed. I say that because he's not Obama, and he was going there not as Obama, and the perception in the region, fairly or not, was that President Obama was withdrawing from our responsibilities in the region, looked at Iran as being a source of the solution to the problems of the region as opposed to being a source of the problems in the region, which is the way both the Sunni Arab states see it and the Israelis as well. So going with that kind of a message was bound to be something that would be very well received. There is one other interesting point, that there is a concern among many of the Sunni Arabs in particular that somehow the U.S. might still withdraw from the region. I mean, once ISIS is out of Raqqa, once it's out of Mosul, even though we may believe that the real challenges are quite profound in the aftermath of that, I think there's a concern that the symbol of success then, particularly with our increasing production of shale oil, makes us have less of an interest in the region. So I think there was a concern that he might be inclined to withdraw afterwards. This trip, I think, sent a message that that's not the case. So that was good. That was very good, because I think it creates a sense of reassurance. It also puts us in a position where we can ask more of the parties in the region, because if we're there, we can also have a set of expectations about what they must do. Here's where I would have liked to have seen, or at least have heard something that suggested the president wasn't just conveying a kind of reassurance, but he was also seeking some steps or assurances from those he was meeting.
Okay, so Juan, the president went to Riyadh, big push on terrorism and radicalism. In what way was this different than either candidate Trump or President Obama in his approach to these issues?
Well, it's interesting because he's clearly trying to reestablish the relationships and reset how America was viewed in the Middle East, and I think he accomplished that. I think in some ways it followed the track of what both President Bush and President Obama had tried to do in terms of engaging the Middle East, in terms of taking ownership of the problems of terrorism, the underlying ideology that fuels much of the movements that we worry about, ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and others. And to deal with things like terrorist financing with the establishment of this new terrorist financing center in Riyadh. Those thematics aren't new. I think what the perception was that this was a president who had campaigned to actually withdraw from the region. And here he was headlong sort of reasserting American leadership in some way, but also challenging counterparts and allies in a way that perhaps President Obama had been unwilling to do, or at least as openly. And you saw that clearly in the Gulf with the challenge for Muslim countries and communities to take ownership of the problem of terrorism and the underlying ideology much more directly. It's not a new theme, but he did it, I think, much more aggressively and bluntly at the start of an administration. And then he did it obviously on the back end with NATO, the call for greater spending on defense from NATO allies right in front of the leadership in a very blunt way at the start of an administration, at the start of a relationship. So I think what was different here for me was here was a candidate that was talking about America first, which felt very much like withdrawal, but here he was headlong heading into these regions, into these relationships to both reestablish them, but then to put the onus on our counterparts and allies to do more in relationship to their defense. That, I think, was a striking thematic from the visit.
Dennis, you mentioned earlier about what the president did or didn't ask of his interlocutors in the Gulf. He certainly embraced their view of the challenge of Iran. What did he ask them to do in return, and what would you have liked him to ask them to do in return?
Well, I think in a sense what he was asking at a high level of generality is what Juan was describing. He wanted them to be joining this serious common effort to take on the ideology of hate and intolerance. What I would have liked to have seen is maybe one more sentence that says, within your own societies, it becomes very important to ensure that governance is also responsive. If we're going to, in a sense, deny extremists, radical ideologies, radical Islamists, a kind of fertile breeding ground, it's also important to make efforts within your own societies in that regard, and also to give a platform to those voices within your societies that are challenging those kinds of ideologies. So that would be a subtle way of, so don't arrest bloggers who might be actually challenging the Islamists, or don't arrest lawyers who are protecting what might be civil society. And we didn't really hear any of that. I wasn't expecting him to do great detail, and I wouldn't have wanted him to, in the sense that it's important for him to establish a relationship to begin with, and I think he was doing that. But I would have liked to have seen a little more of a hint. And I would also say, since he was going to Jerusalem afterwards, this is actually something that you've mentioned to me, I think it's quite right that he should have said he's making a major effort on the peace issue because he believes in it, but he also wants to see that these 54 leaders who are assembled there are prepared to do their part, including reaching out to Israel in an open way. So those are the kind of things I would have liked to have seen.
And Juan, though clearly the commercial part of this trip was important for the president, how much do you think Arab leaders said to themselves, well, we can get America off our back on human rights and focusing on political reform if we buy a lot of weapons from them?
Well, I think that was certainly part of the mentality, the framework of the trip. You saw the Trump administration touting the deals, both the deals for over $100 billion of weapons sales, as well as investment back into the United States for infrastructure. That was very important for President Trump. He talked about jobs, jobs, jobs being a result of this trip. And I think, Arab leaders are smart. They understand that this is a businessman president. He's one who likes to craft deals. He has made his candidacy and presidency about rebuilding America and America's economy and reshaping trade deals and alliances around America first. And so any smart counterparty is going to think, yes, let's think about the kinds of deals that are not only in our interest, but can reshape our relationship and frankly help the way that this president views our country. So the Saudis were brilliant in that regard. The Gulf states were incredibly savvy in viewing that. I think one of the challenges, though, and Dennis alluded to this, is that the president views then foreign policy purely through the lens not just of commercial deals, but purely as transactional one-offs. That there isn't a strategic vision for what then is America's not only ask of our allies, but what is our strategic position in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, even if we pull out of deals, even if we make these particular commercial transactions, what happens next? And I think that's what we're all kind of waiting for with this administration. These are good first steps in the regions, some interesting thematics and messages, but what's the follow-up? What comes next after the withdrawal from the Paris Accord? What comes next after these important trips and deals? That's a real key question for this administration.
And just before our break, quickly, Juan, how will we know if this major administration effort to address radicalism and extremism, how will we know that it's succeeding?
Well, it's tough. There's always a question of how do you measure whether or not we're countering the ideology effectively? Is it because there is more messaging, more television programs, more advertisement, better textbooks that counter the ideology? Is it that the allure of the ideologies has less purchase with certain populations, the youth of Muslim communities? I think in terms of what he was trying to do here, I think the question is, do we see that states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, are actually doing things, as Dennis said, internally to quiet the voices and the tendencies toward extremism, toward takfirism, violence and exclusionary ideologies that begin to define the way they teach their youth? Are you seeing indications that that's being curbed? And are you seeing efforts outside of those countries to actually counter the movement of these groups ideologically, the centers, the radical imams that are actually fueling this ideology? Are they curbing those activities? If not, I would say, look, this is just a Potemkin effort. If in fact there's an attempt to constrain the ideology and the advocates of it, then that is some degree of success.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to move on to Jerusalem and then on to Europe and talk about the rest of the president's agenda in just a moment. Again, our panelists include Juan Zarate. Juan is one of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts. Sitting to his right is Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Let's go quickly to Jerusalem. When all the symbolism is put aside, what practically did President Trump accomplish meeting with Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, I do think much like the trip to Riyadh, this was further efforts to sort of build a kind of relationship. In Israel in particular, I think it was an effort to create a connection with the Israeli public. You look at the symbolism of some of the visit to the Western Wall. You look at the speech that he made in the Israel Museum, which really touched on a series of kind of notes that would be very resonant, strike a real chord in the mind of the Israeli public. One thing that is very clear and has always been clear is if you're going to do something serious on the peace issue between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the American president has to create a connection with the Israeli public. They have to feel that there's a kind of fundamental sympathy. They also have to feel there's a kind of understanding of the predicament that Israel faces looking at the region. And I think he did a lot to create that connection. And the reason I say that's important is when an American president asks an Israeli prime minister to do something, if it's difficult to do, if that president has created some connection with the Israeli public, there's a kind of natural instinct for the public to respond. And that affects the choices that the prime minister has. Now, his visit to Bethlehem to see President Abbas obviously didn't have the same kind of symbolism. He wasn't trying to reach out the same way. But I think also he was doing something else that is highly significant for Abbas, which is to show his relevance. I mean, the fact is, prior to having Abbas come here to see him, no one in the region was paying much attention to him, and his own domestic problems in terms of unquestioning criticism and I think a kind of alienation of much of the public was, I think, really weakening him in his role as a leader. The relevance that he now has again, because he's the focal point for any peace efforts, has been, I think, something quite useful from the standpoint of the administration if they're going to try to build him up to play the role that in a sense they want him to play. Beyond that, I don't know that there was much that was practically done. If there was an effort to work out a set of steps that each side might take to be able to launch diplomacy but have it connected to some demonstrable steps that show something is different this time, if that's in the works, there's no visibility of it. If this was part of the trip, again, we're not aware of it. Perhaps something will emerge within the next couple of months, and we'll see that the trip, in a sense, laid the foundation for that. But that remains to be seen.
Okay, so still an open question there. Right. Let's move on to Europe, Juan, where the message, after having told all those unelected kings and presidents in Riyadh that he wasn't going to lecture them, he certainly decided to lecture our friends and allies in the democratic countries.
Yeah, I think the president left an impression that he was very much more comfortable with autocrats than he was with democratically elected leaders. And it was a little bit of an awkward dichotomy to have that difference. What was good, though, in terms of the European visit, is that the president reinforced themes that had been established over the last few weeks in terms of America's place in NATO and in Europe. We were long gone are the days when we wondered whether or not the president and the administration would think NATO was obsolete, right? That now is gone. The question now is, what's NATO's relevance moving forward? And I think the president in some ways is challenging Europe, was certainly challenging European leaders right in front of their face to help define their own defense, their own future, and frankly to contribute more in terms of defense spending and capabilities into the NATO alliance. As I've said before, this is not a new theme. It's not a new statement. Secretary of Defense Gates, the Secretary of Defense for both President Bush and Obama, said the very same thing upon his departure from his tenure as the head of the Pentagon. But the difference here is this is the sitting president at the start of the relationship, in the heart of Europe, in front of all of these European leaders, many of whom he met for the very first time. And he was setting forth this challenge, as you said, right on the heels of what was a very welcoming, fresh, and comfortable visit to the Middle East. And this seemed very uncomfortable and very confrontational in comparison. And so it really has set the tone for a bit more acrimony, or at least a little bit more distrust between the U.S. and its transatlantic neighbors.
I mean, one has to imagine that there's a bit of what in boxing you would call a 1-2 punch, asking them to do more on NATO, and then just a few days later pulling out of what for them is a huge accord, the Paris Climate Change Accord. Dennis, how do you think this affects our relationships with our key partners?
I think it raises some basic questions. NATO is an alliance of like-minded countries. It's not just about shared interests, it's about shared values. And I think there is a concern now, certainly with many Europeans, that the administration really doesn't share the values, that it's all about transactional relationships, not about relationships that are somehow rooted in a common outlook, a common sense of purpose. And so I think we're going to find not just some of the acrimony that I think that Juan talked about, I think there's going to be some basic questioning about just how reliable is the United States at this point. And I do suspect that there'll also be more of an impulse to invest more in a separate European approach to security. We faced some of this back at the end of the Cold War, when there was an effort to sort of assert more of a European identity. Even though you had American administrations that were seen as embodying the values, there was a question of, with the end of Russia as being this kind of a perceived a shared threat, did we have to redefine some of the purposes of the alliance? And we were able to do that at that point. Now the question is, can we do this again at a time when many European leaders are going to find it difficult necessarily to feel that they have a lot of commonality with President Trump?
Okay, there we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for joining us this week on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الاتجاه الجديد للسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية في عهد الرئيس ترامب، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.